हेलो चेक 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 चेक। हेलो चेक चेक। हेलो चेक 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 चेक। अब तो नहीं जा रहा। हेलो चेक 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 चेक। अच्छा हो रहा है ना भाई। हेलो चेक। हेलो चेक।
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the first plenary. Check. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the first session. The session is entitled COVID-19 New Challenges and Opportunities of Building Resilience to Disasters. The session chair is Dr. Scientific and Technical Committee. And I now hand it over to Dr. P.G. Chakrabarty to take the session forward.
We have rightly flagged technology as a critical issue. Can be game changer. We are extremely sorry for that. Very bad. Sorry for that, my apology. Now today in this panel, and that is the very interesting set of panel we have set up, for discussion on the issue, the COVID-19 and the new challenges and opportunities for building resilience to disasters. So we have in this panel two persons who are physically present, and both of them were extremely very well known in their field. We have Dr. Venkatachalam Thirupuga. Dr. Thirupuga, he was the additional secretary and advisor in the National Disaster Management Authority. And prior to that, he was for a long time the chief executive officer of the Gujarat State Disaster Management Authority, GSDMA. And he also served as the principal secretary of the Chief Minister, Mr. Narendra Modi, when he was Chief Minister of Gujarat. He also served, after the Nepal earthquake, the Nepal Reconstruction Authority. He was an advisor in the Nepal Reconstruction Authority for some time. He did his PhD from Australian National University, Canberra, on disaster management. And after his retirement of service, very recently, Tamil Nadu government has made him the head of a panel to look into the flood mitigation planning for the Chennai city. He's currently doing that. So let us welcome Dr. Thirupuga. So Dr. Manu Gupta, he is also very well known. He is the co-founder of an organization called SEEDS, and that is Sustainable Environment and Ecological Development Society, which has been doing a pioneering work in the field of disaster risk reduction in this region. And the organization that he has set up, it has got a global recognition. It is working not only in India, but various parts of the world. SEED International, which is headquartered in Japan, and Dr. Rajiv Shaw, he is the current chairman. He would also be speaking in several sessions in this conference. So Manu Gupta, thanks for coming here. So we have an extremely good panelist here. So, and I'll be introducing them one by one. So Dr. Devarati Guha Sapir, she had committed to come physically, but somehow she is not able to come. She has sent a video recorded message we will be playing. Dr. Devarati Guha Sapir studied epidemiology and biostatistics in Johns Hopkins University and did a PhD from Leuven University in Belgium, which is one of the oldest universities in Europe, and where she was also the director of the CRED, Center for Research on Epidemiology of Disaster. And they have set up, for I think she joined as a director in '92, continued till I think it's very close it eyes out. So few years back, and she's still teaching public health in that university. She set up the MDAT. Those of you who are working disaster management field, emergency management database. That is the global database on disaster for all the countries of the world for last 100 years, and that is available online. Each type of disaster, painstakingly, they have collected the data, and she would also be speaking here, both as a public health specialist and also disaster data specialist. She would be speaking. She had sent a video recorded speech yesterday, so we'd be playing that. We have Amanda Leck. We have Mrs. Amanda Lack, she's the Executive Director of the Australian Institute for Disaster Resilience. It was known as Australian Institute of Disaster Emergency Management earlier. It is in the outskirts of the city of Melbourne, place called Macedon, is a beautiful place. And she is heading that institute, and she is very well renowned in Nepal and also in this region of South Asia Pacific. She on the community-based, disaster resilience, she has been working. And the Victoria, I think, province, she was in the country fire authority, which is voluntary fire service involving the community for fighting the fire hazards, particularly the fire, the forest fire, etc. She has been involved. So we have Mr. Vinod Chandra Menon. He is also a very well-known name. He is one of the founding members of the National Disaster Management Authority. Earlier, he had worked in the UNICEF as an emergency specialist. Prior to that, he was a professor in the Jasada, that is the Maharashtra Institute for Administrative Training Institute. And currently, Professor Menon is also teaching. He's a professor and head of the School of Compassion, Peace, and Humanitarian Action and Disaster Management in Maharashtra Institute of Technology in Pune. This is the World Peace University where he is currently engaged. We have Mr. Loy Rigo. And Vinod Menon is joining us from Pune. Loy Rigo, that is also another well-known name. He worked in the Asian Disaster Preparedness Center for a long time. He was Deputy Executive Director and then became Director for some time. Then after retirement, he was in Myanmar, and he headed some organization in Myanmar. Right now, he's in Egypt, in Cairo, and he would be speaking from Cairo. And I think I've introduced everyone. And finally, we have this Animesh, Dr. Animesh Kumar. And Dr. Animesh Kumar, he was still recently Deputy Chief of the UNDRR office in Bangkok, and now he is the Chief of the UN team that is in Bonn. And their principal responsibility is to manage this Sendai Monitor, Sendai Framework Monitoring System, where every country reports to him about the progress they have achieved for the implementation of the Sendai Framework, and he does that and does the analysis for them. So this panel we have. So what we'll do is that I will just give a brief introductory. I think flag the issues for discussion today, and then I will request the panelists to say a few words. And I think they'll take about 7-8 minutes. They'll speak each, and they will. And thereafter, we'll first of all, play that recorded video of Devarati Goasapit, and thereafter, each of our panelists from outside, they would be giving their presentations, and then we'll have the physical presentation of two of us, and in the second round of meeting, discussion, we would be discussing among the panelists and with the audience, so that the session becomes very interactive. Okay. So the issues that I am going to raise, that what actually is the impact of the COVID-19 on disaster risk reduction, on the global framework for disaster risk reduction. As you know, that we had the Sendai Framework 2015, we had the Paris Climate Agreement 2015 letter in December, and then we had the New Urban Agenda and all that, and they flagged the issues for disaster risk reduction, and they also set up certain goals and targets. In Sendai Framework, there are 7 goals and targets that were set up. The first 4 things are there, that to reduce, and the next 3 are to increase. So what we have to reduce? We have to reduce substantially the mortality due to disaster. Then we have to reduce substantially the number of people affected by disasters. And we have to reduce substantially the economic losses due to disaster in relation to the GDP of the countries. And we have also to reduce substantially the loss or the damage to the critical infrastructure and to the basic services, particularly related to health and education. So these are the 4 things we had taken, that the global target that was given for reduction. And for increasing, that we have to increase the planning and the strategies for disaster risk reduction at the national level and the local level. So this planning and formulation strategies, that is one thing. And the second thing is that we have to increase the multi-hazard, the coverage and the access to the multi-hazard early warning system. globally. And the third thing, and before the seventh thing about that reduction, so that is another thing that they have to increase it. So these are the targets that they had fixed for the Sendai framework. And you find that at least three of the targets: reduction in mortality, reduction in affected number of people affected, reduction in economic loss. These were also adopted in the Sustainable Development Goals. At least three of the 17 goals. One goal is the eradication poverty. So this goal was adopted there. Number 11, that is on urban city resilience, city and settlements. So they are the same goals and targets were adopted. And 13 third is the climate change. So now the question is that these goals and targets we had adopted, they have to substantially reduce. So what was the extent of the losses that were taking place prior to the COVID? So let us see annually. Prior to COVID, about every year, 100,000 people, that means about 1 lakh people, they were dying on an average every year globally due to disaster. And about 200 million people, that means about 200 million people, that means about 2 crore people, 20 crore people, they were affected by disasters everywhere globally. And about $300 billion we are losing annually due to disaster. So this was the pattern of our disaster for last 10 years average if you take it. So that is the figure. 1,100,000 deaths, 200 million people affected, and 300 billions of losses. Now what has happened after COVID? In COVID alone, the total deaths so far is about 5.1 million. That means 51 lakh people have already died globally. And what are the people affected? About 2.5 billion people are already affected. They were infected by the disaster. They had a virus. They became positive. And what is the economic loss? About 16 trillion US dollars. 16 trillion. On an average, it was 300 billion. Now it is about 16 trillion US dollars. We have lost about 4.5% of the global GDP. These 2 years we have lost. So that means whatever the goals and targets we had fixed in the Sendai framework, and also in the Sustainable Development Goals, and these are very ambitious goals for education for all, health for all, eradication of poverty, removal of hunger. So these kind of goals were set up. So all these goals have been topsy-turvy totally. And you heard Mami Mitajari speaking in Asia Pacific only about 75 to 80 million people. They have come below the poverty line, abject poverty line. So what is going to be the impact of this COVID-19 on this global framework, on the goals and targets? Are we going to achieve this for the remaining period? Are we going to, if we are not going to achieve it, then what are we going to do? Shall we take it only as a kind of isolated, disaster, what they call black swan event, once in 100 years it is happening? So let us not do that. Let us do normal calculations like this. But once we have discussed, accepted COVID as a disaster, so the disaster losses, human lives and property and economic losses must be counted towards these total losses. If that is so, what is going to happen? What is the future of the Sendai framework and the SDGs? Are we going to rejig these goals and targets? Are we going to redefine the goals and targets? Are we going to look into the, revisit this framework to see how this kind of pandemic, if they occur, how we are going to prevent it? How are you going to develop the early warning system for that? How are you going to prepare for that? We had Dr. Balaram, he's speaking in the morning, Dr. Balaram Bhargava, and he said that we have no guarantee that this kind of pandemic will not happen again, because we are intruding into the animal kingdom. Chinese, they are eating, this exotic market from the wild animal market in China. They say it is spread from there. So there is no guarantee that this event will happen once in 100 years. It may happen, earlier also. What are you going to do this? How the global community is going to face this situation? So these are some of the crucial questions that we are going to discuss in this particular session. So without wasting any more time, I would now request that the video of Debarati Gaur Sapir to be played on 7 to 8 minutes video. And thereafter, I'll request our panelist, Ananda Lek, and then Animesh Kumar, then Professor Vinod Menon, and Mr. Loyrigo in the same order to give their statement, and thereafter we will have the presentations of Dr. Thiru and Dr. Manu Gupta. Thank you. So over to, please play the video of Devarati.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and eminent members of this audience. I have been working in disasters for many, many years now, but I have rarely come across a phenomena, an emergency phenomena, like the one that we have been living in the last 2 years. COVID-19 has, in fact, opened our eyes not just of one country, not of 15 countries, not of a region, but of the entire world to the importance of preparedness and response, early response. These are components that the disaster community has been, for many years, has been pushing for, advocating for. That action, early action, is extremely important for any kind of emergency crisis setting, and COVID-19 has opened our eyes to this very, very, very critical preparedness that we all have to have today. It must be said that this outbreak of COVID-19, this pandemic, was not entirely a surprise. As many of you have seen, as early as 2016, Mr. Gates had already predicted such a pandemic. He had said in very, very clear words that the world should be prepared for such a pandemic to happen. But nonetheless, I think it did take us by surprise a little bit, and understandably so, because the nature of it, the extent of it, the amplitude of it was actually far beyond anything that we would have really foreseen in these years. The health sector, which has also been clear, the health sector is actually central to human survival. I think we all know that, we've seen that, and it's part of our lives. We go to the doctors, we go to nurses, and so on and so forth. We realize that. However, I think there are more important lessons to be learned from the COVID-19 experience and the contribution of the health sector. Preparedness and early action. These are watchwords for any treatment of any acute illness in medicine. So preparedness in medicine, the best example of preparedness in medicine is vaccination, of course. And we've done very, very well with it, very, very well with it, with early childhood vaccine preventable disease protection. We have very high rates of coverage, and we've done very well with it. We've done less well for the COVID-19 vaccination problem, and for key reasons. There are two main reasons, I think, two main lessons that we have to learn for COVID-19, which has implications for generally disasters, for emergency, for crisis management, for natural disasters, or even other emergency settings. Two lessons we have to take away from the COVID-19 experience. The first one is media and communications. We have not done so well in any country, in any part of the world. We have not done so well in terms of communicating with not just, say, important people, decision makers in important positions, but much more significantly, we have not communicated well with the population. And at the end of the day, something like a pandemic like COVID or any other pandemic diseases that is inevitably going to be coming up in the next few years, the community communication is absolutely critical. It's absolutely central. If we don't bring the community with us, we will never, ever achieve any kind of a public health or any kind of population-based success for any of these management. It cannot be done only at the higher echelons. It has to be with the people, and to have the people on your side, there has to be communication with the people, which should have been done much better than we managed to do it now. And one of the symptoms of this is, of course, the anti-vaccine feeling, anti-vaccine feeling, the anti-vaxxers as they are called. We see them a little bit everywhere in the world. In Europe, it's a very big problem indeed. And very large part of that can be laid at the feet of inadequate communication and inadequate community mobilization, inadequate building up of resilience at the community level. And that is where I think we have fallen short. That's one lesson. And I think it's a lesson that applies not only to pandemics and epidemics, but it applies to any kind of large-scale disaster like major floods or major storms. It does need to have the community which understand the risk and who take action against it. The second one is a little more technical, as it were, but it really needs attention from the governments. It really needs attention from high levels of the health sector, both private and public, and the NGO sector. And that is surveillance. That is to say, to monitor the process of disease, in this case disease, but it does not have to be. For natural disasters, it could be monitoring something else. Different kinds of mortality, causes of mortality, there are ways of doing it, there are good techniques of doing it, but they have to be promoted, they have to be applied and implemented at a much, much, much higher scale, really scale it up than we have done today. Surveillance is absolutely critical. There are technologies now that allow surveillance amongst at the community level, at regional levels, sub-regional levels, sub-national levels. There are good technologies, but they have not been so far. Health sector is a sector that tends to only come to the forefront of the podium when there is an incident like this pandemic, which is not very often, but we do have epidemics, maybe not a pandemic. But only then, we talk about the health sector. But health sector has these lessons that are very, very critical, that they merit to be taken into account, they merit to be listened to. One is bringing the community with us. That is how the health sector has managed the childhood vaccination programs over years, over 30 years. They have managed to do a very, very, very good job of it. They've managed to eradicate smallpox, which is no small task. And they've done a very good job of polio and so on and so forth. And this is a lesson that has to be learned. The second lesson is finding innovative and creative methods for surveillance for death, whether it's from floods, from storms, from epidemic disease, the risk factors for death, and there are very, very good techniques to do that. And those have to be rolled out, and those have to be upgraded, upscaled, I think it's called. With these two components, if we put them in place as a response, as a lesson learned from COVID for the natural disaster community problem as a whole, I think we will have come out of this in a positive way. So although COVID-19 has opened our eyes, we have to now really think about how long and how well we keep these eyes open. Thank you for your attention. I was sorry not to be there with all of you this year, but I hope to be there again the next time. Thank you.
I think Animesh is speaking first. Animesh
Amanda, I
was
think
speaking first.
Dr. Dhar mentioned that you would go first, so maybe you can go it.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Amanda Leck, and I'm the Executive Director at the Australian Institute of Disaster Resilience. And I would like to pay my respects to you all at the conference there, and I'm sorry I'm unable to join you. I'd like to talk to you about how we shift mindsets to make good decisions for disaster risk reduction. ADA generally works in the area of hazard prevention and preparedness, particularly with a focus on natural hazards, but I think some of what I'm going to talk about is relevant to the global pandemic that we have all concurrently experienced in these last couple of years. So a little bit about ADA. Our work program is really to strengthen the resilience of Australian communities to disasters with a real focus on sharing knowledge and collaborating across a broad range of sectors. So we collaborate across some 27 sectors, including, for example, the Foreign Emergency Services agencies. We collaborate with academia, researchers, the education sector, business communities, and so on. How we describe ourselves is that we are seeking to influence change. So we do that by building and supporting networks of people to come together to have conversations about disaster risk reduction and resilience building, be they young people in school settings, or perhaps it might be the business community looking at resilience valuation initiatives. We have a real focus on capability development. So we run quite an extensive professional development and conferencing program, just as you are conferencing today. We collect, develop, and we actually build, if you like, new knowledge for the country. We have a series of national handbooks that, if you like, bring together the best of the research community's outputs together with the good practice for practitioners in more frontline roles. And they are supported by a range of guidelines and toolkits for implementation, and all freely available to download from the ADA Knowledge Hub. And finally, we provide a central point for national thought leadership on this area of disaster risk reduction and resilience. So I spoke about the handbook collection earlier. It is an authoritative, trusted and freely available source of knowledge. And it aligns our national disaster resilience strategy and policy with practice and guidelines and support for agencies and jurisdictions and business and so on. And we try to highlight and promote the adoption of good practice. And we try to also build interoperability. Australia is a federated nation of 8 states and territories. So we try to get a sense of national consistency through the development of this national doctrine, and as I've said, freely available to download and utilise. So how does this relate to, COVID-19? I think that the opportunity we really now have emerging out of the COVID-19 pandemic is to harness the lived experience of risk that we have all, at this point in time, come to understand, and to build capacity in our decision makers, institutions and communities to consider and address issues of systemic risk. This is related to all hazards. So we now have people's attention, if you like. So I think the first speaker spoke about the need for people to understand risk before they take action. People now understand in a way they never have before that a disaster can strike them close to home in a way that perhaps they had never envisaged before, and that they need to take action to become prepared. This is quite a unique situation we find ourselves in, and I think some of the learnings about how we have had to understand that risk both locally, regionally and globally, and translate that risk into people's lives to take action will stand us in good stead as we move forward to consider other disasters that may impact us. As I said earlier, we have a major focus on building capability, and excuse me, Australia has just established the National Recovery and Resilience Agency, which is our first standing national agency focused on recovery and resilience, and ADA works as part of that. So we are looking to influence the development of new capabilities in Australia in addressing such matters as systemic disaster risk reduction. Excuse me, through financial incentives, Australia is about to launch something called the Preparing Australia program that will seek to do just that. I beg your pardon, I've found myself with a bit of a cough. So this systemic disaster risk handbook that we have just released looks to support the implementation of Australia's National Disaster Risk Reduction Framework, and also draws on the United Nations Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction. It provides a nationally consistent and evidence-based advice on how to identify and think about risk through a systems lens. So when we describe systemic risks, we think about those as emerging from the intersections of climate change and natural hazards, with this notion of independent and interconnected networks and social, technical, environmental and economic systems. So it's not really possible to think about these on a traditional hazard by hazard risk assessment. And I think if you think about it, we would be, if we had done a more of a systemic risk assessment, I think the impacts of COVID would have been more clearly identified across a range of sectors and those impacts. So we're trying to, if you like, shift the thinking to one about systemic disaster risk and systemic thinking. We've identified a whole range of new principles around, shifting mindsets and changing systems. So a real focus on the risk context. So really thinking about what are those risks that are likely to impact us on both a local, regional and global scale, and how those can be addressed. A focus on inclusive governance, and a focus on risk methodologies, so identifying new ways to understand risk. The first principle of the handbook is to embrace uncertainty. So COVID has taught us that the changing risk context involves greater uncertainty and challenges to goals and objectives, and that there are many different perspectives to be negotiated. Inclusive approaches to governance and systems thinking can help chart the way forward. We need not be overwhelmed, but we can't wait for certainty before taking action. And I think that's a key point in relation to what we have faced with COVID. Probably none of us had really taken those sort of preparedness actions at a country scale that have been required. And so that notion about thinking about uncertainty and being able to prepare communities in the face of that uncertainty is going to be critical as we move into a climate change future. Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks. I hope my audio is clearer to the audience sitting in the hall. Good. Good morning, everyone. Very good early morning from Bonn, Germany. Greetings to all of you. It's unfortunate that I couldn't make it in person to this conference as I did the last time. I'm coming fresh from the COP26 in Glasgow and must say that an in-person gathering always makes a difference. As we speak, we have completed 2 years since the first COVID case was detected. And Dr. Dhar outlined the targets of the Sendai framework. While we were making very decent progress in containing at least the human cost of disasters, COVID-19 has completely overturned this progress. So while it is clear that the crisis is not over yet, we're already facing the 4th wave of the pandemic in Europe here, it is also clear that we have advanced in our understanding and knowledge about the crisis and the lessons we can draw from it in the domain of disaster risk reduction. So in my intervention today, I will summarize all the thinking with 3 reflections, 3 challenges, and 3 opportunities. Starting with the reflections. COVID definitely has changed our understanding of risk. Conventionally, we have looked at risk from a siloed lens, doing hazard by hazard risk analysis and assessments. However, over time, we have realized the limitation of this approach as risk is not static, but it has multiple interconnections and cascades across sectors and domains. Both in terms of cause and effect, COVID-19 was a classic case of such a systemic risk, as Amanda put it, that pushed an estimated 90 million people into extreme poverty, while increasing their vulnerability to the impacts of extreme weather events, which have almost doubled over the last 20 years. So most such epidemics may follow and continue if human ecosystem interaction is not streamlined, which points to addressing climate change. This also points to the fact that risk management is not the function of a single organization or the national disaster management offices or agencies or authorities in countries. It's a multi-sectoral responsibility. COVID-19 is a practical example of a disaster that could not have been managed by the ministries of health alone, despite being a health emergency. This applies to the management of all disasters and becomes even more significant when it comes to the prevention of disasters and disaster risk. A second reflection, looking back at the entire crisis, is the lack of clarity in what we have been calling as a disaster risk management phases. A key characteristic of COVID-19 crisis that distinguished it from other disasters was the uncertainty in transitioning from the response to recovery stage. Unlike an event-centric disaster, in the case of COVID-19, preparedness, response, and recovery overlapped. And this resulted in the dilemma of managing the long-lasting shock while preparing for recovery and addressing all pre-existing challenges of poverty and inequality. Hence, countries found it challenging to simply transition to a full-scale recovery. They needed to embed recovery into the ongoing response and risk reduction into response and recovery. And this points us to revisit the classical so-called DRM cycle and look at risk in its totality and following comprehensive risk management approaches to address it well. The third reflection is in terms of risk communication. Communicating during an evolving crisis means information may often be incomplete. In the current state of social media, misinformation moves very fast, and it's very difficult to prevent, often resulting in an infodemic. And this is something we saw during very early stages of the pandemic. At the same time, the last mile outreach of messages has also been an issue. People with specific vulnerabilities defined by age, gender, disabilities, and those living in remote areas are often more vulnerable due to limited access to information. And then I'll move towards some of the challenges that we need to put more thinking in resolving them. The first challenge we have observed is in terms of the dual impact of COVID-19. For example, COVID overlapped with several other disasters, as seen in the initial stages with Bay of Bengal with Cyclone Amphan, in Vanuatu with Cyclone Harold, in the Philippines with Cyclone Wongfang. Cyclones and other disasters and earthquakes continued to happen while COVID proceeded. In situations where disaster managers are dealing with crisis on multiple fronts, responding to one disaster may worsen the impact of another. For instance, COVID-induced mobility restrictions hindered safe evacuations, while physical distancing regulations affected evacuating large number of people to temporary shelters. The restrictions imposed for COVID-19 containments created significant barriers to conducting key preparedness actions, such as simulation exercises, for example, the tsunami simulation drills. So it actually not only had a health impact, but also the pandemic impacted the disaster preparedness for other non-COVID related disasters. The second challenge, which we continue to recovering from, are the impact on businesses, in particular the micro, small, and medium enterprises that make up over 90% of registered businesses in developing countries. In almost all the countries, SMEs have faced severe losses. The OECD has had actually estimated that 50% of SMEs in Thailand and over 40% in New Zealand face the grim situation of shutting down forever. This was further worsened by the informal nature of the SMEs, and even the formal SMEs are often outside the purview of socioeconomic assistance. So existing business resilience tools, such as traditional business continuity plans and business recovery plans, are often and almost geared towards addressing natural hazards or operational risks. Health-related hazards seldom get reflected in the risk registers, and it also severely distorts scenario-based planning, as the timing and duration of a pandemic can never be predicted. So this resulted in the breakdown of supply chains, and this is felt even till now. The third challenge has been in terms of the declining fiscal space. The COVID-induced economic downturn and increased market volatility and a continued crisis affected global financial stability. A large decline in revenue could reduce the fiscal space of governments at a time when they're rolling out huge economic stimulus packages. And a declining fiscal space means a reduction in expenditure on several other sectors, including those that would have resulted in long-term resilience building. Nonetheless, despite these reflections and challenges, the COVID recovery process also offers a lot of opportunities. The pandemic itself can become a catalyst to change the development approach to one that is risk-informed and prioritizes the people and the planet. COVID recovery process does provide opportunities for green growth. Economic incentives and investments to restart economies should be geared to promote cleaner and more resilient infrastructure. While there are important short-term challenges around how to manage the shock, governments should not compromise long-term global objectives around decarbonization and climate change. As the UN Secretary General had put it, post-COVID recovery should lead to a new normal that is more equitable and climate sensitive, and nature-based solution has a huge role to play in this. The COVID-19 crisis has amplified the growing calls for resilient and adaptive infrastructure that can effectively operate during moments of crisis. So as countries plan for recovery, they should invest in infrastructure projects that offer the opportunities to address short-term job losses, but also long-term resilience and decarbonization. The $1 trillion infrastructure plan by the US government at this point is just a very good example. Strengthening of DRR governance is a very strong second opportunity that we have. Several countries, as we saw, including India, Maldives, Vanuatu, used DRR mechanisms for COVID response. The COVID-19 has forced several countries to revisit their existing disaster risk reduction strategies and plans with an eye towards making them multi-hazard and multi-sectoral. This is a welcomed development and a big opportunity. Countries that are in the process of developing or revising their DRR strategies should also seize this opportunity to reflect comprehensive risk management and climate-induced information in their planning processes. And finally, social protection. That is a key opportunity for many countries. The 2008 financial crisis demonstrated very clearly that countries with robust social protection system suffered the least and recovered the most quickly. Support to social protection needs to be at the core of all stimulus packages. To be effective, social protection mechanisms need to be ex ante, that is designed in advance of a crisis, need to be shock responsive, that is to be agile enough to be scaled up during recovery and response, and to be universal so that we don't miss out the vulnerable households. At the end, I would end my intervention by also highlighting some additional opportunities. The ongoing midterm review of the Sendai framework, which is expected to be completed by end of next year, and taking place at the same time at the global stocktake of the Paris Agreement and the development of the post-2020 CBD, offers us a very unique opportunity to incorporate the lessons that we have learned from COVID into all these review processes. And again, I would invite all of you to attend the next Global Platform for Disaster Risk Reduction, which is taking place in Bali, Indonesia in May next year. With this, I would end and thank you for your attention.
Okay. I thought you were asking Vinod to speak first, but since you asked me, I'll just jump in order to minimize a loss of time. So I'm speaking more broadly on pandemic preparedness, response, treatment, and recovery. Some macro lessons that can be learned both from COVID-19 as well as the epidemics of the last quarter century, and trying to focus on what more needs to be done. How do we build resilience in this new context and in spite of it? And how do we, most importantly, accelerate action towards the SDGs, which must be achieved by 2030? And this is challenging itself, given the targets, but even more challenging now with the context of COVID. Now, you see, a global scale pandemic was previously experienced 100 years back, but it's not that long ago. 1918 to 1920 pandemic, the Spanish flu, killed over 40 million people. And while that number sounds large, we are still going through with 500 million deaths and probably a significant increase still to come. So, of course, vaccinations have helped. We've had major events, the Asian influenza pandemic in 1957 and 1968. But in the last 25 years, this is not a new phenomenon. We haven't had a global pandemic, but we have had multi-country pandemics. And we have the avian influenza, the SARS, which was an eye-opener for many of us in the region. I lived and worked in Asia at the time. MERS and Ebola, which hit 3 countries in Africa on a significant scale. And each of these was eye-opening, not sufficiently to help us recognize that there could be a global pandemic, but at the same time, it shocked the countries. And I must say that WHO took the leadership with the ministries of health in establishing pandemic preparedness plans in each of the countries worldwide. I want to talk about another effort which is important and which the WHO took was the International Health Regulations, or IHR. And those of us in 2005, which was adopted by 2007. And this is not something which we in the disaster management sector are familiar enough with. We need even now to get more involved and understand it, connect it with the Sendai framework and our efforts at building preparedness, quite apart from building response capacity and recoveries. What has been really shocking in the pandemic is its global scale, the free fall of economies in a very short time frame, the speed with which the epidemic spread or the pandemic spread globally and in each of the countries and regions, and those that responded quickly in shutting down actually saved us all from further acceleration. It could have been worse. And those that neglected to take action are suffering even today. We need to link pandemic preparedness with wider disaster preparedness. And there was a major effort called the PREVENT program, which ran from 2005 to 2011. And it was a global pandemic preparedness effort funded by USAID, but led by WHO, WFP, FAO, and the World Trade Organization. And it helped build capacities of thousands of workers across the world. And in fact, adopted what we today call as Towards a Safer World initiative. And for this document was published in 2011. I will send you the web link or the full name. You can search for it on the web. And for those of you who have difficulty, please come back to me. But it is eye-opening to read this document today, not just today, but 2 years ago. And I remember having personally participated in the conference and in the program as a whole over the 6 years. And at that stage, we never expected something as severe as this. So in some ways, this is similar, the impact of the tsunami. Both of them unexpected in their scale, in the numbers of countries that they covered, and there are lessons to be learned. So towards a safer world, definitely focus on giving recommendations and promoting action in 11 thematic areas: global health, community, private sector, animal health, logistics, communications, travel and tourism, with a focus on what, how, and where we should learn lessons from the pandemic and take specific actions for pandemic preparedness. And it's important and useful to look that 11 years back, we had these clear recommendations in writing. It's also useful for us to look back and dialogue with our health partners in each of the countries on the IHR, which was led by WHO, but worked closely with the ministries of health. And it's both animal health, food and agriculture, and WHO who work together, as well as these three ministries in each of the countries. And while disaster management relates to all of them, we don't focus so much on these ministries, so we must build better links with them. Pandemic preparedness action has certainly strengthened coordination mechanisms nationally and internationally for other emergencies. And many countries developed interdisciplinary task forces nationally and subnationally, including involving non-traditional actors. And while this may seem normal to those of us in the practice of disaster management, the reality is that we have not really worked with the health sector as much as we should. And we haven't necessarily worked where the so-called non-natural disasters have a focus. So, for example, industrial accidents, road accidents, and epidemics on this scale are areas that we need to, while referencing the Sendai framework, need to be better coordinated with. Even the evidence of the last 2 years shows us that we are not yet prepared for another global epidemic. And I don't want to be predictive, but the next one will strike well before the last one is forgotten. And we must take action. So what needs to be done? And what is the multi-sectoral effort that needs to be taken? I would strongly advocate that we need to work at multiple levels on multiple hazards and make changes. We need to reflect at the local community level, cities, districts, states, regions, and nations on how our pandemic response has been and what future steps need to be taken for pandemic preparedness. I'm not talking of the response to the current emergency, but planning for the next one. We need the positives now. Let me talk about. We have had simplifications in lifestyle. We've drastically reduced international travel. We have a greater emphasis on national agencies doing work independently without international support, and this is a good thing. We have widened access through new modalities of global meetings virtually. And this has a positive environmental impact. It reduces costs, it expands the portfolio. There's a loss in personal interaction, but there is a gain in terms of bringing new people in. And at significantly reduced costs. And this in fact should continue in the future. While we can have personal meetings, we should also continue global modalities. Zoom Twitter, WhatsApp, Skype have helped, and they have certainly built new linkages. There is increased social interaction at lower costs, and we have built new relationships and permanently altered the nature of our interaction. What are some of the challenges? We have to deal with simultaneous occurrence of floods, cyclones, and earthquakes with other risks. They may be industrial accidents, they may be epidemics or pandemics, and we need to know when there are contradictory actions prescribed in terms of responding, what we should do and how we should marry these approaches. We need to, how do we tackle migration and loss of employment for migrant workers and their abandoning the cities and going back to their villages, spreading the disease, and we're not tackling it enough. These are challenges that we faced. But positively, we must innovate both in our food habits, minimize our travel compulsions, change our attitudes towards leisure-based travel, learn more about our countries, learn from the changes we are living through, innovate, expand, and transfer the positive changes. We should look at what new behavioral changes have happened and environmental actions we can promote and institutionalize well into the future, even in the post-pandemic phase. Who will implement these transformative changes? We need to ask ourselves. How do we localize development activities? And this is our humble way of looking at the kind of social changes that are needed. So disaster preparedness needs to be multisectoral, needs to link with development action, and more importantly, the SDGs are a much wider development agenda. We need to push them as much. So I will talk further in the second round on how to link with the SDGs, but these are some of my humble comments on the subject that I was given. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. I feel that actually when we have to speak on the challenges and the opportunities due to COVID-19, I would like to mention six major challenges and also highlight 6 major opportunities. So I think if we can look at what are the big 6 major challenges from COVID-19, I think the first and foremost is the system failure. System failure in terms of the inability of governance systems to do anticipatory governance when we knew that there was actually a pandemic which was around the corner. And lockdowns are a window of opportunity for ramping up surge capacity. But however, we have seen that in many parts of the world, lockdowns were used as an instrument to basically do the kind of design of an aircraft while the aircraft is already airborne. You know, you are actually responding to everything in an ad hoc manner, which I think is not what we should be doing in a system where we should actually be aware of the kind of issues which we need to address. So the lockdowns actually has been described as almost a death sentence by John Dries. And we see that the migrant workers, when they felt the countrywide lockdown, it is not abandoning the cities. It was actually a survival strategy for basically saving lives and also protecting livelihoods if possible, because they do not have the luxury of working from home. Now, if you look at the second challenge, I think we need to look at the moral hazard. The moral hazard from, the COVID pandemic is something which we have to recognize. The moral hazard is in terms of the inequities which we are seeing around us. What is the vaccination percentage of fully vaccinated people in Africa? What is the access to healthcare in many countries around the world? 221 countries affected by the COVID pandemic. And what is the access to education, access to food security, access to rights and entitlements, access to inclusion, access to participation, and in social decision making. I think these are some of the issues which we need to address. Social protection has been really a major challenge. The third challenge, which I think which we need to really understand and grapple with, is the fact that in the last 5 years or 6 years, we have seen that the hard-won gains of Sustainable Development Goals, the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction, the Paris Agreement, the New Urban Agenda, all these frameworks, the hard-won gains in the last 6 years have been reversed suddenly by the COVID-19 in 2020 and 2021. And that is where poverty and deprivation becomes a challenge. We need to really reverse that and also make sure that, we need to really capture the space. 2021 to 2031 has been declared by UNEP as, the decade, the UN decade for ecosystem restoration. So we need to really see that, the big picture view has to be seen. We have been actually witnessing an inability to see the big picture, the inability to address systems thinking and design thinking, and finally, the fragility of lives and livelihoods in a connected world. And we see that this is actually going to become a threat if we are not careful, because we need to address the vaccine inequity and we need to address the lack of access to healthcare, because otherwise that is going to be, really hitting all those places and all those people who feel that they are in the comfort zone. We are not in the comfort zone anymore. And finally, we need to accept the fact that the new instruments for disaster risk financing, we need to really explore and understand, because risk transfer instruments have to be understood and we need to really design and be innovative in finding the solutions. And so what are the opportunities which are actually provided? 6 opportunities which I would highlight. The first is a new humanitarianism. A new humanitarianism which is grounded on volunteerism of people who are alumni of educational institutions, of senior citizens, of housewives, of people who really wanted to come forward and then help the people who were in distress. The millennial aspirational transformative agenda, whether it is from Greta Thunberg, or whether it is from the young people who were actually assembling in the COP26 at Glasgow, we need to understand that there is something which we all need to stay together in a connected world. And from individuals to families to communities to networks, and I think networks are going to be the mantra for a new transformational agenda, for a new change. And that is where I find that there is a huge opportunity, because sitting here in India, you would actually be connected to what is happening in Peru or what's happening in Canada or what's happening in Ecuador or in Madagascar. And that is a huge opportunity. We are in a connected world and we need to use networks to respond effectively. And the new toolkits which have emerged, we have seen that data is actually at a very huge premium, and we saw, inability to really accept data. And if you have to really look at the artificial intelligence algorithms, machine learning, big data analytics, geoinformatics, and robotics, and also scenario analysis and modeling, these are all opportunities which are actually provided by information technology. And as I mentioned earlier, the UN Decade for Ecosystem Restoration and looking at nature-based solutions, looking at the fragility of the environment and the climate change and global warming and sea level rise and all that. The most poignant message from the COP26 was the minister from Tuvalu standing in the sea and then addressing the COP26 at Glasgow. And finally, I think the last is the livelihood restoration, which is a huge opportunity. Livelihood diversification as an opportunity, whether it is the artisans, whether it is the fishing community, whether it is the craftspeople, whether it is the people who really believe in cultural heritage around the world, whether it is in the Caribbean, whether it is in Latin America, or whether it is in Africa, we need to really work with communities at distress. And I think that is very much important. And I would just mention that Martin Luther King Jr. said, history will have to record that the greatest tragedy of this period of social transition was not the ardent or not the strident clamor of the bad people, but the appalling silence of the good people. And this silence is deafening. And I think that, we talked about zero tolerance to avoidable deaths and disasters, but I think, as a practice, as a community, as a society, as nations, we have let down our people. And I think we need to really make amends to that, and that is where the opportunities lie. And I hope that, we will actually strengthen the networks and work with networks and reach out to help each other. Thank you.
Is it really premature to talk about lessons learned, building resilience based on the lessons learned, challenges and opportunities, as the pandemic is not over yet? Because we are seeing that some of the countries and the states which performed well in the beginning are not doing so well today. Even in Germany, where more than 75% of the people have been vaccinated, around 30,000 to 50,000 cases, a small nation, 50,000 cases are being reported today. So learning lessons is work in progress. We cannot conclude that we have learned lessons. Nevertheless, from our experience of this nearly 2 years, we can look at some of the challenges. The first challenge is lack of expertise or experts who have actually managed a pandemic of this nature, size, and spread. This is a fact. We have to accept it. We didn't have the expertise, not only in this country, nowhere in the world we had this expertise. Yes, we had experts who were good in their work in epidemiology, who have treated patients successfully, or who have managed small-scale pandemics, but never a pandemic of this size, nature, impact, and spread. So we didn't have expertise to start with. Second is conflicting advice, opinions, and suggestions from these experts. Somebody is saying that let people loose, let there be herd immunity, things will become all right. Some other expert is saying put more locks, tighten the lockdown, nobody should come out, the virus will not spread. Even today we are seeing these conflicting opinions. Somebody is saying that booster dose is good, somebody is saying that booster dose is not necessary. So we didn't have proper advice how anybody will decide, how people will act, how governments will act, other stakeholders, NGOs, if there is conflicting advice and opinions from the experts. Third challenge was lack of role clarity. So what should I do in this pandemic? What is my role? Not many institutions and not many stakeholders had this role clarity. But the irony is that everybody seemed to know what others should be doing. What you should be doing, I am very clear, but what I should do, I am not very clear. Actually, in NDMA, many people used to come and meet me and say, this is a very big pandemic. So we are in this field, but we don't know what to do. What should I be doing? So there was lack of role clarity. We should do something vaguely, but we don't know what I should do. Then the fourth challenge, some of the earlier speakers touched upon this. Was this lack of information, as said, or was it too much of information? What was the real challenge? We are living in the age of an infodemic, which is worse than the pandemic or endemic or whatever. This social media, flooding people with information which is not correct. So in this infodemic, how will you reach people with the correct information? Educating people with the right information amidst fake news was one of the real challenges. And also we saw that a deluge of pseudoscience and irrelevant information. How many videos and educative movies government can make or other stakeholders can make, health department can make? They can make 10 videos. But there are 100,000 fake videos which are going around, and these 10 good videos get submerged, immersed in these fake videos. And pseudoscience, grandmother's remedy, great grandmother's remedy, the remedy which Adam practiced and Eve practiced, all were advocated. And how will people understand? What will people do? And the next challenge is, see, are we ever going to outsmart the virus? Or do we have to wait a long time, as we are waiting in the case of common flu or common cold? Are we going to outsmart the virus? If we are not, then will we ever have a normal life again? Maybe 6 months, 1 year, 2 years? We will look at each other's faces. Or are we going to adopt, or we have to adopt to this new normal and live like this? We are not very clear about it. The next is, whether there is going to be another pandemic. One of the earlier speakers said, yes, it is coming. It has already reached someplace. Is it like that? Will there be a next pandemic? The question is if or when there will be a pandemic. We do not know. So summing up all these challenges, I can say that the real challenge is to move from world risk society to a world resilient society. We are now living in a world risk society, not exactly in the way Ulrich Beck defined it. Nevertheless, the spread of this virus in all the 200 plus countries is basically that international travel, anthropogenic causes, people not following the guidelines, so many other reasons. So the real challenge is, how do we move from world risk society to world resilient society? Then we have to learn lessons from this pandemic and our experience. If you search Google, if you type lessons from the pandemic, you get 20 crore 50 lakh results within less than 1 second. You get that. Have we learned so many lessons? 4 lessons from the pandemic. You can see 5 lessons, 10 lessons, 15 lessons. Have we really learned? My advice would be, don't be in a hurry to learn lessons. The pandemic is not over it. In the beginning, when some of the states and some of the countries did well, we found case studies, how these states performed very well. Their models were advocated, reasons were attributed to their extraordinary performance. But within a matter of few months, the tables turned, and those countries and those states became the toppers in the number of cases. What happened to the lessons learned? What happened to the case studies? So let us not be in a hurry to learn lessons and conclude. We should examine our frameworks, legal framework, regulatory framework, but do not change them if it is not needed. See, there is a tendency in the immediate aftermath of the most recent disaster, change the legal framework. The tendency is to make it more prescriptive to a particular disaster. Don't do that. Don't change them if it is really needed. After you have learned the lessons, don't do that in a hurry. Because if you add more laws, make the existing laws more stringent and put in more regulations, how on earth the same mechanism, the same machinery, which could not implement the existing laws, is going to implement these additional laws? How are they going to implement it? More stringent laws, how will they implement it? Don't do that. Failure of implementation of an act should not lead to creation of more acts. We should understand that. Second is, let's examine our institutional arrangements. Yes, we should examine them. Don't change them if it is not required. As far as institutional arrangements as well as frameworks are concerned, we should analyze whether what we have done or not we have done. There are 3 types of errors. One is error of ignorance of the law, act, regulations, plans. Second is error of intention, whether there is an error of intention or whether there is an error of implementation. If all the 3 are not there, then we have to look at the frameworks and institutional arrangements. I would very much subscribe to the advice given by Petronius Arbiter, Roman general before 2000 years. I'll read the quote. We tend to meet any new situation by reorganizing, and a wonderful method it can be for creating the illusion of progress while producing confusion, inefficiency, and demoralization. So we should not do something because we should be seen doing something. So let us understand the lessons first. Because what has worked and what has not worked in this pandemic is only one instance. We should remember that. The uncertainty and infrequency of this pandemic nature makes it hard to validate the strategies. If it is earthquake, I can understand. If it is flood, one can understand. The strategies have been vetted, validated hundreds of times. But is it so in the case of this pandemic? We should keep this in mind. And also we should remember that identifying the lessons is not the same as learning lessons. There is a huge difference between identifying the lessons and learning lessons. As far as lessons are concerned, there are 4 types. One is lessons identified. Whatever we are talking now are the lessons identified. Then second category is lessons lost. In the immediate aftermath of a major disaster, we do so many activities, but over the course of time, they are forgotten because new disasters come and we forget. I'll give you an example. In 2006 in USA, a committee was constituted after the SARS and they worked on reusable masks. Extraordinary report. Did anybody read it? Did anybody hear about it? After 2008, these then members of NDMA worked out a pandemic management plan and they had prepared a business continuity plan and all. Not many knew about it. Those had to be unearthed. So second is lessons lost. The third category is lessons buried. Deliberately, we bury some lessons. Unpleasant ones we bury. The third category is lessons we bury. And then only the fourth category of lessons learned. Then what do I mean by lessons learned? That is, lessons learned means we have to identify the lessons, contextualize those lessons, implement those lessons, and evaluate those lessons. Then only we can say that these are the lessons learned. Are we prepared at this stage to say this? Nevertheless, some common lessons have been learned, which is not very different from the lessons learned in all other disasters. One is need for a coordinated leadership and action, need for communications, good planning against weak planning, and need for resources. This you find in all disasters, and we find it in this disaster also. Now, if we learn lessons, then what are the opportunities? One is many of the opportunities have been already spoken about. I'm not going to repeat them. Some, according to me, are urban planning. We talk about urban and spatial planning from the point of view of other hazards. I think we should also do it from the point of view of pandemics, because congested settlements, slums, and poor settlements, even rich settlements which are congested, did not allow people to have social distancing, and infection spread in those places. Second is, even government schemes, we have to have a relook at our social housing schemes, the way we plan the settlements, the space we give in our social housing schemes. Is it really adequate for maintaining social distancing? We have to look at it. Third is, I think it's a very good opportunity to introduce public health education in schools, disease prevention, basics of epidemiology, and other fundamentals of public health. Fourth is, I find that this provides an opportunity for teaching people, laymen, how to read and understand medical news. That is the only way to encounter fake news. We sending replies, rejoinders will not reach people. So can we use this opportunity to educate people? Then some other opportunities, promote work in remote working environment, decongestion of cities, and people need not travel much, less carbon footprint, and all those good side effects. And promoting telemedicine is a wonderful opportunity to reach rural areas through telemedicine and promote e-learning and online learning, not as a substitute for classroom learning, no, as a supplementary method for learning, and also institutionalize some of the good work done in the form of psychosocial counseling through telephones and video and things like that. And also enhance the role of non-state actors, particularly civil society organizations. A very good initiative was taken in this pandemic to set up NGO coordination centers and cells in the state level SEOCs and DOCs at the district level. Can we make it a permanent institution so that it will help in all other disasters? And also redefine the nature of engagement with non-state actors. This is very important. Mostly the engagement is in the aftermath of a disaster. But this pandemic shows that there is a need to engage with these non-state actors, which will be helpful in other disasters also in mitigation and prevention. And the lessons, whatever we have identified, should be incorporated in our state, district disaster management plans, and they should be implemented and monitored and evaluated. We need to have a serious look at the decision-making process. This is a very good opportunity to look at our decision-making process. How did we decide? Where did we go right? Where did we go wrong? And also to apply the lessons learned, not only for pandemic control in future, but in the larger framework of disaster risk reduction. What happens is, if there is a recent disaster, all our actions become focused on that particular disaster, and we forget about all other disasters. That should not happen. David Key has given a beautiful table. I am not able to show you the PowerPoint presentation about the human response to major disaster. What happens is, in the immediate aftermath of a disaster, there is panic and fear. Then for about a month, 15 days to 1 month, there is coordination, state, non-state actors, all of them come together. They engage in search and recovery, relief. And then for about 6 months, they engage in recovery. Then after that, for about a year or 2 years, they work on improving the regulatory system, legal system, and all that. And then slowly after 5 years or 10 years, the whole thing is forgotten and other priorities take over. And then the next disaster strikes. So the real challenge is how to keep this momentum on, how to remember the lessons and sustain our efforts. That is very, very important. So as I see it, the only way to improve disaster governance is, Sendai priority talks about improving disaster governance, but how will you improve disaster governance? The only way disaster governance can be improved is by improving everyday governance. If you do not have good everyday governance, crisis governance is not possible. A person who cannot walk cannot be expected to run. So we have to improve the everyday governance. That's all I have to say. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for this opportunity to Mr. Dhar Chakravarti and the organizers. It's hard to follow such an eloquent speaker, but I'll try my best to bring out few points that in a way complement what the previous speakers have said. And I'm conscious of the fact that I'm the last speaker, so I'll be brief. So of course, in the last nearly 2 years, we have seen lives being lost, more lives being lost than last 20 years in disasters. And as a global society, perhaps more people affected at the same time as ever before in human history. The pandemic has, of course, like many speakers have said, exposed many knowns and unknowns here. We always knew that preparedness and disaster response is a broken system. And we have been putting band-aid solutions to the system all this while. But it suddenly became so very obvious. We knew about the fragility of our infrastructure, particularly health infrastructure at the first mile, and our dependence on the important role of frontline workers, in this case, frontline health workers. We also knew the enormous losses that are caused by cascading effect of multiple disasters, such as the March 2011 Tohoku earthquake and the nuclear disaster that followed. But to witness the scale of overlapping and interlocking disasters this time was perhaps never in the wildest of our imaginations. And true to what Dr. Thiru said, there were no experts to handle this scale of events. Together with lives lost, I think we saw a great amount of socioeconomic impacts everywhere, multiplying uncontrollably. But perhaps what was more alarming was what we did not see and did not foresee. We realized, for example, the vulnerability of the huge migrant population that we host in our cities and neighboring towns. They were shunned by their own communities, by their own employers with whom they had spent generations together. And of course, the further marginalization of lives of those who had already vulnerable due to disparities of discrimination and other social stigmas, and whose ability to live in dignity had always hinged on the support of social contacts and networks. Or for that matter, with many of us spending more time online, the risk of leaving behind people who did not have adequate access to online resources. Not only we faced losses in education as school dropouts increased everywhere, we also witnessed a spate in domestic violence among women, and the number of distress calls increased threefold everywhere. In the words of the UN Secretary General, this pandemic laid bare risks we have ignored for decades. Inadequate health systems, gaps in social protection, structural inequalities, environmental degradation, and the climate crisis, of course. So in view of all these, what are the lessons that we identify? And I am conscious of the fact that we are still work in progress. But here are some that we can already start listing down. One, of course, the urgency of the problem at population scale. I don't think we have a strategy that can address emergency at such a scale. And then how do we move from risk reduction and risk management, as was said by also Mr. P.K. Mishra in his recent lecture at the Roorkee University, from risk management to resilience building, revisiting our conventional tools of managing disasters. And all that without losing the awareness of the context through decentralized action and keeping people and now nature at the center of our interventions. So of course, we are now, as has been put by all previous speakers, we are lagging behind in our goals for the Sendai framework and the SDGs overall in terms of Agenda 2030. The question is whether the world, as it grapples with this ongoing pandemic, is in a position to accelerate progress and still be on track for 2030. I believe that there are opportunities that we have learned, and many speakers previously have also highlighted good lessons that we have learned from this pandemic and that hold that kind of promise and opportunity. Our own work at Seeds, of which I'm a co-founder, we responded to this challenge that we had never faced before. We stepped up, we reached out to almost 500,000 people, set up COVID care facilities. We reached out to the micro businesses across the country, over 2,000 micro businesses. And we are right now running the Kavach vaccine adoption program to reach out to the unseen people. And we have reached out to about 200,000 people who would not have received vaccination otherwise. And so what have we learned and witnessed in this action that we surged towards? One is, of course, in India and many other countries around the world, we witnessed an unprecedented surge in humanitarian activism. Overnight, thousands of citizen volunteers, especially youth, came forward. Our own 100-member staff was actually supported by almost 1,000 volunteers across with their boots on the ground. And we found that civil society actors across the country, now that they were shut off from the rest of the world, really pulled in whatever little resources they had to be able to serve the communities they have always been serving. In spite of supply chains and mobilities seriously curtailed, we saw an explosion of innovation, of domestic small businesses around the world adopting new systems of trade, of commerce, redefining work and interactions. And we noticed how quickly we repurposed businesses to meet the growing needs. Vaccine research and ability to reach 1 billion people in such a short time are just some of those indicators. And finally, like what Dr. Thiru said, an unprecedented cooperation between government and civil society and business. The Sendai framework has always spoken about the whole of society approach, and its potential was full play during the pandemic. And we could see that play out at local level in the states and many, many other grassroots communities. Finally, coming to what can be those catalysts for action in view of all these towards keeping our SDGs and particularly the Sendai framework on track towards 2030. Madam Mami Muzitori mentioned the midterm review that is going to take place next year and the following year. And I think that's an opportunity to reset some of those baselines at this point of time. But here are 3 action points that Dr. Daisaku Ikeda mentioned in the proposal to the United Nations. 1, strengthening people-centered global governance and establishing global guidelines for combating infectious diseases. I think we need to unearth these guidelines that have been hidden and buried, like what you said, Thiruji, and actually develop these afresh. The SDGs have observed communicable diseases like AIDS and TB and malaria, but there is no explicit mention of the word pandemic in the SDGs. These proposed guidelines on combating infectious diseases need to be linked to the SDGs. And we do have some frameworks in place. The WHO has come together on the HEDRM principles and the Bangkok Declaration about 2 years prior to this pandemic. And I think those frameworks are available to us to really connect these new guidelines to the SDGs. The second thing is that we need to invest more in our social protection system, a portfolio of interventions that provide lifetime of social assistance to individuals facing financial challenge. And this has been spoken about, so I don't want to go into the detail. The third is the need to adopt comprehensive, simultaneous, multi-hazard approach to threats and challenges with a clear understanding of the systemic nature of risk. I think we have to move away from this lowest common denominator approach, and Animesh had spoken about this very vividly, to a more dynamic framework that recognizes the intersectionality of risks, but also improves our ability to anticipate potential impacts better. So as a way forward, I think this midterm review of the Sendai framework, the final draft of the Asia Pacific Action Plan 2021 is just out. I think these are the instruments that we need to pin our hopes on. What is important is that we look at our institutional architecture. Thiruji spoke about institutional arrangements, urgently to embrace some of these vital points that we discussed today. The need for people-centered multilateralism is one. 2, the need for being able to better address uncertainties at scale and urgency, perhaps using technology, and the need to build social and economic resilience going beyond merely reduction of losses. Thank you. These are my points.
See, I do not know about India because yesterday I read in the newspaper that DG ICMR has said that there is no evidence that booster dose is going to be effective. Something like, we are not living in US, we are living in India. So
Actually, on that, there is no, conclusive evidence that booster must be given. So that is not the priority. Priority is to vaccinate all those people who have not been vaccinated at all or who have been vaccinated only once. So that is a major challenge. Anyway, there is a health issue. I think there is a next session for the Indian Council for Medical Research. So that will also be available on the, they are doing it from their center, and so it will be telecast also. You can have our next session is the School of Planning Architecture. That had to start. I'm sure that they are all present, so I would not waste time for that. And I'm sorry, my virtual speakers, I kept you waiting because I thought there will be some discussion, but the time is a constraint here. But a lot of very, very important issues have been raised on the challenges, on the opportunities, on the lessons learned, on the lessons learned, or lessons buried, or lessons forgotten, or lessons yet to be learned, or it's too early to learn all this. So very, very interesting discussion, and I thank all the panelists for their contribution. And so we would be going through this in a very minute details, and then we'll be coming up with some kind of a declaration at the end of the conference where all these important the issues that have been raised, recommendations have been made, will be consolidated in the form of a declaration, which will be very useful. So thank you so much. Thank you all the panelists for their
one question.
One, please.
Thank you, Dr. Thiru. And you rightly pointed out, and its necessity for urban planning and social housing distances is the most crucial decision. We have to take it. Lot of things are going in the cities and rural areas. The housing plan is not very good at it. And rightly pointed out, we have to take it in a very initiative way. We have to implement it. Thanks, sir.
thank you.
Before we close the session, may I request Dr. Dhar Chakrabarti to kindly present mementos to the esteemed speakers. We'd like to thank all our speakers who joined us virtually, as well as those who are present here. Big thanks to both of you. Thank you for making this session very, very enriching and lively. May I request Dr. Dhar Chakrabarti to kindly do us the honors of presenting a memento to both of them. There is a memento, there is a certificate of participation. We'd like to thank Dr. V. Thirupugas, former advisor, National Disaster Management Authority. Our thanks to Dr. Manu Gupta, co-founder Seeds. Thank you, Dr. Dhar Chakrabarti, for doing us the honors of presenting the mementos. And now, with your permission from the chair, we would like to close the session here. And we'll request you to please be back on time. And I would like Dr. Chakrabarti to announce the time this time. What time shall we start? What time shall we announce? Because officially it says at 2:30. 2:30? As we heard from Dr. Dhar Chakrabarti, School of Planning and Architecture would like to start it a little early. So we would really request you to hurry through the lunch break, and if you can join us well in time so that we can start the session by 2:15. So we'll start the next session at 2:30. Please be here on time. Please gather before time so that we can start the session sharp at 2:30. Thank you.